we just get into the questions, or
I
did you want to?
I can read a little blip here. One of my favorite passages of the book. So it's kind of to this section kind of shows how I use my personal story to talk about bigger issues in agriculture. So it's not really just a memoir. The intention of the book was to talk about bigger issues. But this is just a passage that I happen to like. So it's talking about oats. So we decided to plant oats as a cover crop, but also we thought we were going to make some money off of it. So this is kind of starting in the middle of the chapter. But about a month later, John began the arduous seeding process, broadcasting the seed while the ground was still covered with snow. Miraculously, the oats did all they were supposed to do, ecologically speaking. They germinated earlier than their weed enemies, their little green shoots bursting through the soil, growing faster than the grasses. By May, at the end of the oat plant's short life, the fields had turned golden brown as the oats dried. The guy who was to combine them for us was excited. The spring had been cool and wet, he said, ideal for growing oats. Maybe the neighbor was right. Maybe we could grow great oats in southern Iowa. But the cool and the wet had a downside too. The oats were not drying as fast as they needed to, and the grass, clover, and alfalfa were beginning to catch up, which would make harvesting the oats much more difficult. Then the wind came. The storm was fast approaching, clouds stretching to the ground like a black veil traveling toward us from the not-so-far distance. We all stood on Andrea's porch, a very Iowa thing to do in a storm, as a wall of cold air enveloped us, the bushes in front of the house bending horizontally as if hit by a wave. Suddenly the top of a 40-foot-tall, dead-standing tree snapped and crashed to the ground not far away. My sister-in-law, a normally cool and calm Iowan, unfazed by extreme weather, hung her head out from the side of the porch to get a better view of the open fields to the north. Okay, let's get into the basement, she stated matter-of-factly, the first time in all my summers on the farm that anyone had ever gotten nervous about the possibility of a tornado. The five of us headed down. Even the dogs who never came into the house were carried down the stairs. The rain hit the windows as if someone had turned the hose on full force. The sound against the siding as if someone had turned the volume up to 11. Then, as quickly as the faucet had turned on, it switched off, and we all immediately went outside to see the damage. A few trees were down, branches everywhere, but no tornado, no houses flattened. That night, the men did what men do, and talked about how they never thought the storm was that big of a deal, how they had all seen so much worse in their lives, and they couldn't believe we had actually gone into the basement like a parade of weenies. But the oats had not fared so well. Many of the plants were now lying flat. Days passed as we waited for the ground to dry out again, the other grasses getting taller every hour. Suddenly, we were faced with the question of whether or not we should bother to harvest them. The combine guy tested a patch a few days later. Everyone's bubble now burst by the actual low yield of 25 bushels per acre, which barely filled the back of the grain truck. I climbed up the steep ladder into the grain bin and collected a baggie full of the oats, the strong smell like fresh bread, but greener. The closest grain elevator was about 10 miles away, a collection of metal silos and a red building with a truck scale outside for weighing the corn and soybean loads usually hauled to the facility by the semi. Oats? The woman behind the counter asked politely. She took the sample bag as she would with any farmer's grain and put it into the machine to test the water content and weight of the seed, the telltale signs of whether the grain would garner the highest price. It's not really working, she apologized after a few minutes. We don't ever really weigh oats. The owner was called. After a bit of fumbling around with the machine, a verdict was announced. The oats were still too wet and did not weigh enough for them to consider buying. We're having a harder and harder time selling oats from down here in southern Iowa, the owner told me. We just can't compete with Canada and the northern states, he added, where oats seeds were larger and heavier. Was there another crop besides corn or soybeans that we could grow and sell in this part of the world? Would his company buy something else? Not really, he stated matter-of-factly. You might think about growing rye, I guess. You could sell rye seed to other farmers for cover crops. I asked whether or not he had heard of kernza, a perennial getting a lot of attention in places such as San Francisco, because it produces a seed good for bread and cereal, but does not need to be planted and harvested every year like corn. He looked at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. No, was all he said.
I like that passage a lot.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, it's a common theme in the book is you and your husband attempting something, and when you ask for help, when you seek help, kind of encountering a lot of people who have no idea what you're talking about. You know,
Yes,
like
it happens a lot.
yeah, it seems like the environment for experimentation in your little part of Iowa is pretty minimal.
Yeah, and there's so in a lot of the book, what Eric's referring to too is like, and when we went to the USDA offices, and we were continually met with like just blank stares when we asked about organics or trees or anything besides corn and soybeans. People just didn't have any knowledge, and there's one point where we were like, no, there's some programs for organics, and they were just like, no, like she'd go around and ask everybody in the office, and she'd come back around, no, there's no programs for organics. And then, like, of course there were, and there are a lot of things that, you know, to be fair, are also available to other kinds of farmers, not just organic farmers, things for conservation, for example. But there was no, you're right, there's no momentum behind it. There's no real interest, because, you know, with the Farm Bill is something that happens every 5 years or so. And, you know, when you have these policies that change constantly, you have to learn a whole new set of them. You have to learn how the new program works. You've got to figure out the new system. There was a new computer system when we started. We're now on our 5th, I think, this is our 4th year of farming. We're on at least our 5th head of the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, that in our county. So there's just a constantly revolving, you know, situation there where they can't really, I mean, you're not going to take the time to learn a whole bunch of programs that you never are going to refer to. You're just not going to do it. So yes, we were consistently met with like blank stares and just no real information that was very forthcoming.
Yeah, that sounded like a particularly frustrating element, especially in your first couple of years. So I guess I can dig kind of into the questions that I've prepared. So for people that haven't read your book yet, can you kind of briefly share with us how your dream of farming kind of came about, and what motivated you to change the course of your life so drastically?
Yeah, so I was a food and agriculture reporter for about 20 years. We were living in San Francisco. That's where I met my husband, actually in Berkeley. He was my neighbor, and he was a butcher at the time, and like was in the intro, he had been a trained chef, a produce buyer, a wine buyer, then he became a butcher. And the minute I met him, I mean, literally, I think the minute I met him, he said, "Oh, I just was in Iowa with the kids." He had two sons. When they're grown, I'm headed back. And I was like, "Okay, Iowa. I don't know if I could show you it on a map where it is." At the time, I didn't know anything really about the Midwest. I had lived on the East Coast. I had lived on the West Coast and the Rockies, but nowhere near this region. So, so he was dead set, like this is what he wanted to do. And at the time, you know, once we dated, fell in love, whatever, got married. You know, I just was like, oh, that's some other time. That's going to happen, you know, way out there in the future. And as it came closer, you know, there was a part of me that thought, well, I've been covering this for this long. I have a real interest in it, and this is a chance to really kind of play out everything that we talked about. You know, our whole lives were food. So we can, you know, have a farm. We can do all these things, and we started visiting out in Iowa and seeing, okay, corn and beans. John's dad grew conventional corn and beans. He had cattle, and so we started dreaming about what could we do and what would we want to do. So that's kind of how it evolved. So it wasn't completely crazy for me to pack up your life and move to the really very, very rural area. It's about an hour outside of Des Moines, south of Des Moines, and so it wasn't completely crazy. But on the other hand, it was, you know, for a Jewish girl from the East Coast living in San Francisco, you know, it was kind of crazy at the same time.
Big shock. Did you know anyone, like, so something that I've noticed with a lot of the farms that we have partnered with and farms that I've visited, there is a pretty common theme amongst a lot of the emerging farmers of that, I mean, even less of a connection to farming than you had through your husband. It was more, maybe they were urban co-op shoppers that kind of became tuned into the state of food and decided that they wanted to play a bigger role in that. But so there's I've met a lot of people, a lot of farmers who did what you did. Did you know anyone that did anything like this before you? Someone that you knew either in you know, on the East Coast or the West Coast?
No.
No. Okay.
So, that's the short answer. So, I mean, we spent a lot of time on farms, reporting on farming. There was a lot of connections, you know, in the Bay Area with specific farms that we had purchased from, or like the Full Belly Farms, which is one of the biggest farms in the Bay Area. Very, very. They've been around probably 30 years doing organic vegetable operation. They had a big party. Really, it wasn't even a festival. Really, it was this great big party every year that we would go to and work at. But no, I didn't know anybody who just kind of up and went. And the book is partly for them to say, okay, know what you're getting into at least, because I think one of the big problems is that we have to be able, in order for sustainable agriculture to be sustainable, it has to sustain over a long period of time. And I think what happens in a lot of those farms is they don't last more than 5 years or so. I mean, people quit because it's so much work. And you know, I try and talk about the mythologies in the book a lot, about how hard it is to, you know, it's not this agrarian dream where you just are like, oh, I'm going to get my hands in the dirt, it's going to be great. You know, there's this whole economic side of it that you have to kind of really understand, I feel, before you jump in.
Yeah. So jumping in, okay, so kind of going off in a slightly different direction. So one of the things that I was very pleasantly surprised about reading the book is that it is about so much more than your personal journey. You kind of weave historical and political and personal together to tell a story that is similar to what countless emerging farmers are also kind of facing across the country. Was it always your intent when you sat down to write this book? Was it always your intent to make this kind of not just a memoir, but like a guide and a history and you know, all the other elements, or did you kind of discover that along the way?
Yeah, I mean, as a journalist, as a trained journalist, that's, you know, the setup. If you don't, you know, if you look at any news story, it starts with that lead, is usually that anecdote about the personal. and then it goes into what's the background of the issue. So that was like how I was trained to write and to kind of think. My paradigm of the world is like, well, what is this story? I mean, I even teach it this way, you know, now when I teach about writing, it's like, what is your memoir? Why should anybody care about your memoir?
Mm.
Like, there's a lot of people out there who want to write a memoir. What's it really about, besides just you? Because it doesn't really hold people's attention that long unless it's a, you know, drama-filled history. But I guess, like, in the writing of it, I mean, I was always acutely aware of, like, our privilege was something that I really wanted to, like talk about that very openly, to say, this isn't just like, oh, we just so happen to be here, we just so happen to have this land, and it's like, there were actually, there's historical, political reasons why John's family is there, and not people from the town that was just, you know, 9 miles away, that was full of African Americans during coal mining days, and virtually none of them are there anymore. Like, I literally don't think, I know the person who wrote the book about the town, I don't think there's one family from that town, and it was a really unique town where a lot of black families owned land, they owned shops, they owned hotels. They no longer do. And so the reasons why John's family was still there had a lot to do with the various supports that were there, that always, the USDA loans, the bank loans, so those were things that I really wanted to discuss, and in just like a, not really like making it political, these are the facts. Like, this is what was available as opposed to what was not available over there, you know, those kinds of issues. So I felt like it was, and thinking like, this is a book, this isn't just an article. That was where, you know, there were so many points that I could jump off into to talk about bigger things. That was always my intention.
Thank you. So that actually kind of leads into another question, a couple other questions that I had. So there's a chapter early on titled Sharing the Pie. Well, maybe it's not early on, I can't remember the placement now, but Sharing the Pie, you discuss cooperative models for farming. And as a way to break down some of the barriers that people who want to farm often face. You also talk about the history of cooperative farming and how it used to be a pretty common practice, but it's since kind of gone away. Can you talk? So, assuming that you know, people are fairly familiar with the general model of a co-op, or maybe they understand how like a food co-op works. Can you talk a little bit about the farming co-ops and kind of, you also shared some ideas that you and your husband had for ways that you could use your land in a cooperative way to extend opportunity to people who might not be as privileged as yourself.
Yeah. So cooperatives in agriculture have really always been a thing. They're really, Land O'Lakes is a cooperative. Organic Valley is a cooperative. These are groups that came together often from the same reasons, like there's economic issues, and they banded together to say, let's purchase seed together, let's sell, have a marketing co-op, let's sell our milk together. And so they've always been a thing, and they've gotten oftentimes to get with farmers to have a very bad reputation. A lot of farmers have joined them in order to like I said, seeds, or to get your chickens from the co-op. And then what's happened oftentimes is that, like many things with humans, right, we have these tendencies to have bad leadership, or somebody takes advantage of the situation, or the marketing money is suddenly going, someone's flying in planes somewhere, you know. So these kinds of things have happened, and they've gotten sort of a bad rap with a lot of farmers. And that's something that's real and exists now with people who have been in farming a long time. The flip side of that is that there's also kind of an idealism about it. Like you hear at a lot of farming conferences about cooperatives and how like people have these romantic visions, like we're gonna get together, and we're us included. I want to be clear about that in the book. I'm very clear how it's like, you know, is it just a dream? We can get people together. We would do all different things on the land. We cooperate. We work together. We'd share. You know, we could go on vacation. They would look out after our animals while we're gone. So, you know, there's kind of an idealism about it. But somewhere in the middle of all of this is some really, really important possibilities that are where we can work together, we can have opportunities that are enable everybody to purchase things together, market things together. So our vision for it is that, you know, our idealized version of it anyway was that we would offer the land for free. People could come and work with us alongside us and have chickens, let's say. So I should back up and say, we raise grass-finished beef now. We have goats. We do a lot of hay. We don't have as many cattle as we could. There's a lot more possibility for running lots more animals behind our animals, so we could have chickens and chicken trucks and, you know, all these things that you see on YouTube videos and, you know, things about sustainable agriculture. We could do all of those things, but there's two of us in our 50s. And that's not going to happen in a realistic world. And I think that's part of what, again, the problems with sustainable agriculture is people get into it and want to do everything. Or like, oh, I've got to have those chickens because they're going to be the sustainable thing to have after that cattle. But then I've got to also nourish my community, and I've got to have the kale, and I've got to sell, you know, I've got to have all these products. And then again, 3-5 years later, you realize that you've run yourself ragged into the ground, and it's not a possibility. So we still have this vision. We still trying to get people to come and farm with us. We'd still love to, you know, rent it for free. But what we've learned is that all of the adjacent issues in rural America are issues with our vision. So lack of housing is a huge problem. So nobody's going to come out to nowhere rural southern Iowa to farm with us and really not have anywhere to live, right? Or the lack of any kind of vibrant economic anything going on, right? It's a little bit tough sell to say, okay, why don't you move down here? You'll have no social life. You won't have anywhere really to live, you know. So it's unfortunately more complicated, but we're keeping this vision alive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the lack of social and cultural kind of infrastructure in particular. It sounds like in the part of Iowa where you live is another part of the book that I was really I found very fascinating, was just how much that barrier exists to getting people out there. Is the fact that there are no vibrant small towns in Iowa anymore. They're all ghost towns with, I think you said, a dollar store, a gas station, and a tavern maybe or something.
Yeah,
so
that's what we have in our town. So we have a tavern. I don't know. It's a shack of a bar.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a Casey's and a dollar store. Yeah. So I mean, the flip side of that. So I guess it just goes back to say that there's a lot of people walking around a place like Minneapolis who are thinking like, oh, I'd like to be a farmer, right?
Yeah.
But there's also those people want to be farmers in like right outside of Minneapolis,
Yeah.
or Sonoma Valley or the Hudson Valley, like places where people have done a lot of work, quite frankly, to like get things up and rolling and have that kind of environment. So I think it's possible anywhere. You know, one of the places that we visited in like last February or something, is White Oak Pastures, which is a farm in southern Georgia, nowhere Georgia, like we're talking not near anything. They have been around for like maybe 30 years though, doing regenerative grazing. Will Harris is the patriarch really of that family. He's a southern gentleman. You know, and they now do everything. So they have their own processing there, their own slaughter facility, their own. I mean, you can order up a tallow candle and a purse and some ribeyes and rabbit, you know, and have it delivered tomorrow. I mean, they really do everything. But what's really fascinating about that farm, because we went there and we were like, holy cow, like we could never, we're in our 50s again, like we can't accomplish this sort of a farm in how many years we have left. But the real takeaway from it was we were sitting listening to a bunch of employees talk, and one of the employees, he made kind of a joke. He said, you know, most farms have $3 million worth of investment and 2 employees. We have, you know, and he joked, $10,000 worth of equipment, which, you know, I guess it's probably all broken and they're sharing it and whatever. But it's probably, let's say, $7 million worth of investment, $10 million. They have 169 full-time employees.
Wow.
It's a town again. I mean, that it was never, like, hasn't been anything, a blip on the map. Now suddenly they're talking about opening a school. There's people coming from big cities and wanting to do internships and then staying and buying homes and renovating them and bringing skills, data skills, and, you know, all sorts of skills to the farm that they never could have imagined. They wouldn't like put an ad in the paper like data specialists to analyze, you know, our processing. But here's this young woman who was, you know, a brilliant financier in Manhattan. Now she lives in southern Georgia, you know, and so for us, it's kind of that. Like, what if the investment that goes on to keep the system running in this, like, you know, JBS, Tyson, big farm way, what if that investment started, you know, being funneled out into different places, into tiny towns, and instead of being in the stock market, you know, I just feel like there's a lot of there's possibilities that we have not thought about in that way. But to come back to your question too, with the social and cultural, you know, lack thereof in rural America, I mean, I guess it's also an argument to be made that we don't need that everywhere. You come into the city and you go see a show and eat out fancy stuff, and then you go home. Like, I mean, I really felt like in San Francisco, there wasn't a lot of that I was doing anymore. I wasn't like out every night, you know, enjoying the city's, you know, dynamic cultures. I was at home, probably watching Netflix, and, you know. So, I mean, to have the quiet, we were just talking about this today. The quiet was something that I did not know I needed, like deep in my soul. That's not cultural. Maybe it's in the realm of spiritual or something. But those kinds of things, there's a lot of upsides to living in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, I can concur with that. I lived in the country for a couple of years and I miss it. I'm back in the city and yeah, a readjustment phase, getting used to city noise again. So I had the opportunity to interview one of the largest Kernza farmers in Minnesota last year, and just as an attempt to kind of...
That's a co-op, that group?
Yes,
okay.
and that was what he talked about, was to help protect the investment, you know, instead of a lot of these farmers experienced kind of the opposite or the dangers of not communicating and not cooperating with crops when the CBD oil boom happened and a bunch of people were growing hemp, and then the price of hemp bottomed out because too many people were growing it and no one was telling each other, like, hey, we're going to grow this much, what are you growing? And so all these farmers just had mountains of hemp that they couldn't get rid of, and so the few farmers that are currently licensed or whatever the certification for growing Kernza is, that was a major element for their planning was, especially with a crop that's still in experimental phases, and we carry it on our shelves, but it's still a little on the spendy side, so it's yeah, but it's going to help protect them against issues that they might encounter otherwise. And
Yeah, it's a really cool thing. I mean, if you all don't know about Kernza, it's a perennial crop that I was just reading about, but it you can make breads, and it's a flour. You can make a flour out of it. That's very good. But that cooperative is it's a really interesting thing because it's patented. That seed is patented, so you have to actually purchase the license. And because it's has particular, like any crop, it has particular things that you need to do to grow it. What's one of the really interesting parts of that cooperative is that they're sharing information. Like when you take on, you say, okay, I'm going to join the cooperative, I'm going to have the license, you get information sharing with that, which I can't emphasize, especially for people who are heading out from the city, I'm going to go farm.
Yeah.
The learning curve is ginormous. So, I mean, I think that having something that you know something about,
Yeah.
or have people resources available is really an important part.
Yeah, and that's this kind of is adjacent to another point that maybe you hint at in the book. A little background: Kernza is developed by a nonprofit, or I don't know what their particular status is, but a group called the Land Institute, in conjunction with the University of Minnesota, and the whole purpose is to create a grain that's more environmentally friendly. Right, it stores more carbon in the soil. It helps prevent erosion, helps water retention, and because they don't have to rip it up every year, that carbon gets stored for eventually, hopefully 6 or 7 or even 8 seasons. So wasn't designed by Monsanto to maximize shareholder return. It was created by with a very established goal, and I think that's I don't know, a tricky issue. You talk a lot about the very stubborn individualism that seems to be at the heart of our perception of farming, but it seems like you maybe think that's maybe I'm off base, but that's something that we maybe need to do away with if we want to continue farming sustainably.
Well, I think that, I don't think that there's anything in farming, or probably anything in the world, that we all have to do the same, right? We don't, we shouldn't all be growing corn, and we shouldn't, no one be growing corn. There's a large range there in between. And so, I think it's the same sort of thing, there's always going to be the rugged individuals who want to tough it out alone, and it's one of the myths that I kind of break down in the book, this whole idea of doing it alone and not talking with each other, and then getting caught up in this whole oversupply, everybody's trying to have the highest yield possible, and as a result the prices are usually on below your cost of production. So I think that for me it's the variety, right? We need arguably I would say that you don't necessarily need corn. If it went away tomorrow, I don't know, we would drive less. 50% of the crop is used for ethanol now. And it's pretty fascinating. In every pump in Iowa, it's like ethanol, ethanol, ethanol. And you drive out of the state borders, and it either doesn't mention ethanol or it says no ethanol. Like, that's the selling point. No ethanol. Yeah. Don't put this in your car.
I see it a lot less.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. So, you know, yeah, we would have less ethanol. But I think it's just that we need to have people doing a diverse range of things. We can't, especially in a place like Iowa, some of the most fertile ground in the world. Most years there's rain, even when there's not a lot of it. It's still a heck of a lot better than what's going on in the West. And we need to start thinking, like, really start thinking about what's happening after ethanol. I keep talking about, like, a new policy, like, let's call it the Beyond Ethanol bill, and we'll start thinking about what happens after. What can we grow? How can we have a variety of crops? How can we be establishing the structures and the logistics in the state so that there's places to sell your carrots if you're growing carrots? Or, these are things that we have to start thinking about now. And some of it has to come from people not, saying mine, and this is my land and I can do whatever I want with it and I can, drill in well because it's mine. Some of that is going to have to be eroded. And I think there's a lot of people willing to. I think there's there's always this perception, and I see it in the media. I am part of the media, so I like to be critical of my profession. There was just an article about our tiny town in the Des Moines Register about, how everyone's upset about gas prices and it's such a conservative place. And yes, but there's also other people in the town. There are other people doing other things who are not complaining about gas prices and are not, just have Trump's signs on their houses. I mean, it's just, we have to recognize the variety in all of these things, and the need for it.
Well, yeah, it's with more farmers growing a wider variety of things, it creates markets that don't currently, or creates markets that people could then move into to create a demand for. You talk about in the small town chapter about how if people were growing a number of things that then restaurants could move in to buy the specialty crops from smaller farmers, and bakers could come in to buy local wheat. And yeah, this is very much kind of the dream that we in the co-op world kind of envision, is a very not 100% black and white, but thriving and resilient local food economy where grain is harvested grown and harvested in northern Minnesota, and then milled in the Twin Cities, and then baked at a bakery next door. And yeah, it's I found that part was very much interesting, and I enjoyed that.
Thanks. I appreciate that.
So.
Yeah. Oh, Scott. So I think we're supposed to do questions. About questions.
I read the book, enjoyed it, and the thing that I learned more about, most of it was I've never slept on a farm overnight in my life. But your discussion about the support system and the way that the government interacts with the agricultural sector. If you could summarize for a couple minutes the whole program, and then say what you would say to Grassley if you could get his ear.
Grassley. Our senator. It's time for you to leave. That's what I'd say. Yeah, actually, okay, so government subsidies. So a large reason why I wrote the book was that I felt like a lot of books about sustainable farming, whatever we want to call it, presents presents the issues in a very like, oh, it's all subsidies' fault. Farmers are brainwashed. Like it's all agribusiness. So one of the things that I really wanted to establish is to look at the issue with some empathy and think about why do people do what they do. Farmers are not all uneducated, minions of big business just kind of doing what they're told. They're doing those things because it solves a lot of problems for them. If I was going to do the easiest, most profitable thing, I would be growing corn and beans. It's easy. Like you go into the store, the seed places nearby. You say, I want, what do you recommend? Oh, you recommend that? Okay, take that. What sprays go with that? Okay, great. I put it in the ground. I visit a couple times a year, and the people come out and spray. I harvest, and I drive it to the elevator. I mean, it's and so what happened was that in order for after the Depression, during the Depression in particular, the country was like, how do we ensure that we're going to have enough to eat? I mean, these were times that are not these times where food is, yes, there are hungry people. I don't mean to belittle that. But there is a plethora of calories to be had, not necessarily nutritious calories, but there's a plethora of them out and about. So government structures were kind of formed to support that, to have farmers not have to deal with the risk of putting all of your money into this seed, putting it in the ground, and then, there's a drought, it's all gone, I'm out of business, we all have nothing to eat. So the subsidy structures were that was the intention. They have grown to ensure that we have a really stable supply of commodities still, so that bellies stay full. I mean, if we think about, poli-sci 101, full bellies make, empty bellies ends in rebellion. Those two things are linked always and forever. If people are hungry, they get rid of their governments. They rebel. So this system, the subsidy system, has in very many ways just it has amped up, and so it's become more and more that there's a lot of calories out there. There's a lot of low cost commodities to be purchased by large agribusiness. If I had Grassley's ear, I guess I would, just to go back to what I was saying before, is this idea of like we need to think about what's next. Iowa has an economic opportunity in front of it to take advantage of the fact that our food is going to become probably more expensive. There's going to probably be less variety as we go along. There's going to be, already it's like chickpeas. There's like a 20% less chickpea crop that's coming in. They're expecting really high chickpea, like these different kinds of markets are being affected in different ways. The almonds are going to get more and more expensive probably because more people are ripping them out because they should have never planted them in the first place in California. So there's a great opportunity. And I would just say to him, I think he's very motivated by money, by economic opportunity. I think there's a lot of it there to be taken advantage of, and that we need to be thinking about not only how we're feeding our populace, but how we're nourishing our populace, and how Iowa can be in the front of making changes in that way.
It seems like a common theme across many sectors these days is there are many opportunities if we just take them, to move away from the things that were profitable and successful in the past that are no longer proving to be.
Yeah, I think they're really complicated problems. So, like undoing the JBSs and the Tysons and the Cargills, making more opportunity and having that infrastructure be taken over by who exactly? I'm not sure. So it works in the benefit of agribusiness, but I mean, people keep saying to me, "Oh, well, if we had this, wouldn't food be so much more expensive as all local food?" And it's like, already the cost of food has gone up. Well, who's made profits over these last couple of years? JBS, Tyson, record profits. PepsiCo. So yes, we are paying more. They are making a lot more. So I say, you can go for this low-hanging fruit of CEO pay, of really high profits, of private companies. I don't know. I wouldn't say we should regulate, CEO pay, but isn't there some morality behind there? Like, people are hungry at inflationary prices, but meanwhile I'm going to make record profits. There's something there's a dissonance there that doesn't work for me. I don't know how you sleep at night in that situation, but yeah.
Yeah, one interesting and to me pretty significant detail or quirk of inflation has been how much slower it's hit a lot of the local food in the Twin Cities, at least, and I don't have any quantitative research to back this up, but I just know in our stores, we didn't have to raise prices for much longer after a lot of the other big ones were, and part of it is because our chicken producers, for example, are so small they can't go through the giant processors that JBL or JBS and Tyson use. They have to go through smaller local processors and there are more numerous smaller local processors, and so if one of them gets shut down by a COVID outbreak, it doesn't suddenly drive the price of 20% of the country's chicken through the roof. So I think there's a lot of reason to believe, and it sounds like you're saying much the same thing, that with more decentralized, I guess, food bottleneck, like we'd have fewer bottlenecks if our food system was less centralized through.
Yeah, there's numerous studies that people are looking at this phenomenon and over COVID, and the resiliency of a different food system that is more based in local movement of goods, that it's much more resilient. Because exactly that, like, we're not dependent upon something necessarily traveling long distances, but there's also numerous producers as opposed to one. So if everything is coming through Tyson, if we have to get all of our chicken from Tyson, that means that if something goes wrong with Tyson, that's a huge problem.
Well, I think it was Tyson and maybe Cargill just settled a lawsuit over colluding to keep wages down.
There's four companies. Yeah.
They were all sharing wages and benefits in an attempt to make sure that no one was paying more than the other ones so that they could keep their wages down. It's
yeah, all of those in most commodities, it's only like 4, possibly 5 companies that control the entirety of meat, beef, pork, chicken. I would say the same is even true for grains. There's Cargill, ADM.
Yeah.
They really, and when you look at it on a world perspective, when those companies have control over the world's grains, that's kind of a crazy thought, right?
Well, and the price of synthetic fertilizer going up because of how much of it comes from Russia, it's
yeah, and it already was. They're notorious. As soon as corn and bean prices went way up, at the end of, I guess it's been about a year. The prices went way up. So after a decade of below the cost of production, the price went up, and so all the producers are excited, woo! And so then, typically, like every other time, the cost of all the inputs went up. The seeds, the fertilizer, everything went right, matching it. And, and then it got worse with Russia and Ukraine and all of those supplies being, not available.
Yeah, kind of a argument for creating your own fertilizer, right?
It's an argument for animals on the farm.
Yeah.
So we really need that. So she's saying one more question if anybody
yes.
else has one. Yeah.
What's something you're doing to, you said like sustain the sustainable, what's like a practice you're doing to do that?
To make our farm more sustainable. Yeah, so I mean it was just this big, when we went to the White Oak pastures, it really hit me that this whole concept of regenerative agriculture, which is a term that is thrown around a lot right now. It's like that's the term in agriculture, regenerative. So meaning like you would help nurture the soil and you mimic nature as much as possible. But it really hit me when we were there that I was like, generative generations, like this has to be able to last for generations down the road. Not just we could put in 1,000 trees, 10,000 trees, we could do every practice just perfectly, and the minute we're dead somebody plows it over. And it's really so we had a couple come visit from Wyoming. They read the book and were all excited and got in touch and ended up traveling to us to see if they would farm with us. And we all really got along. It looked great, but we learned so much from that experience, in that we didn't have a plan for somebody. We didn't have jobs. Like we go in agriculture, we say like, oh, do this internship, now own a farm, right? There's like no other field that you would do that. Like, oh, you interned at a media company, you should own a media company, right? Like there's a lot of time and experience in between. So we really realized when they visited that like, oh, we can't just be like, oh, you could come and do anything, and maybe if you want chickens, and they were like, well, I don't know what I want. I'd like to make some money, have some experiences. So we've hired two young folks from town. Neither of them, I think that they will do agriculture for forever, or but one of them is, he just graduated high school, the other one is 21, and it's just been such a wonderful experience for us, like, especially this young woman who's 21. I said to her the other day, I was like, oh, is this what you thought it would be, or what? She was like, I just grew so much emotionally and physically, and I was like, emotionally? Like, what is that about? And I think she just, it was a physical job for the first time in her life, that I think there were probably many moments where she just like wanted to cry and not lift this heavy thing, and she felt at this point like it really has changed her life. And she's like visiting farms, she's talking about doing woofing, which is a thing you can do around the world on organic farms, and she wants to go do that. And so we're just realizing that in order to be sustainable, like, we need some housing, we need some jobs available, we're trying to have a barn built where we can have cooking classes and events, and like try and make something where there's pulls into it. Like, we can't just say, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, to farmers, don't pollute, we have to have draws into like what is something that can be done, and what are so that's really where we are right now. If we could find someone to build the dang barn, and get our act together, that's where we're gonna head. So. All right, well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Be out there.